What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another video. And with all the stuff over the last few months about Windows 7 having lost support in January, and people still not wanting to switch to Windows 10 for various reasons, sometimes due to the interface or due to the fact that they just don't like Windows 10 as much as Windows 7, many people are learning more about Linux, and there's been a lot of videos about why you should switch to Linux instead of Windows 10. And you may be asking, what is Linux in the first place? I'm kind of confused on what exactly it is. Well, given the name of this video, I think it's probably pretty obvious. That is what I'm going to be explaining today. So first, let's clarify something real quick. So the thing that you may be hearing about most is GNU Linux or GNU/Linux or GNU plus Linux. It doesn't really matter how you want to say it. You can say it how you want. You can even just say Linux. And most people are just calling this Linux. And the reason for that is just because it's easier to say. It's easier to understand what you're talking about when you're talking about just Linux instead of saying GNU Linux. It sometimes brings up more confusion if you say GNU Linux and you are talking to somebody who is new to Linux and they don't really know what it is. So now you may be wondering, what's the difference between GNU and Linux, and what is Linux if GNU Linux isn't necessarily Linux, even when people like to call it that? Well, GNU is an open source operating system and collection of a bunch of computer software, most of which is licensed under GNU's own general public license. And one pretty funny thing about GNU is that the name GNU, just like many other Linux and open source project names, is a recurring acronym. So GNU stands for GNU'S, not UNIX. Just a real quick funny thing I decided to put out there. So now let's get into where GNU and Linux are related. So GNU started out with the GNU Herd kernel for its kernel, but due to its status as not being ready for production use, it was sort of replaced with Linux for the time being. And the duo of GNU and Linux became so ubiquitous that it just all became known as Linux. And with most people saying either Linux or GNU Linux, with the majority saying Linux. And that is why you would have heard it being called Linux instead of GNU Linux. And now that we have that clarified, with it being clear that Linux is the kernel for the GNU Linux operating system, and most people are just calling it Linux either out of ignorance or because they feel like saying Linux instead of saying the whole GNU Linux. You may be wondering, what are these Linux distribution things that I am coming across in these videos? What is a distribution of Linux? So to answer that question, first we need to look at what is open source software. So open source software is software that has it so their code is open to the public to modify and use how they want to, and even redistribute it. And that is where the name distribution comes from. So in short, a Linux distribution is a redistributed and modified version of GNU Linux. So there are really only two main distributions. There's Debian and Arch Linux. I think there's a couple other ones that are directly based off of GNU Linux, but they're sort of not very well known. And then there's distributions based off of these distributions. So for Arch Linux, you have the likes of Manjaro, and for Debian, you have the likes of Ubuntu and Antix, Ubuntu being one of the most popular distributions of Linux. So overall, Linux is basically Windows with a bunch of different layouts, you could say, and you can choose between any of these layouts. The biggest difference between distributions now, it used to be much more with the distributions sometimes even being almost like as different as Windows and Mac. But now it's more just the environment, the desktop environment, how the desktop looks. Most of the use cases are the same. Some distributions you may want over other ones, mainly because of the stuff that is installed out of the box. But overall, it is just your personal preference on what distribution you would like to use. Alright everybody, that's all for this video. If you like this video, hit that like button and subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you all in the next video.